Good evening. Tonight, we descend into the blood-stained valleys of ancient Laconia, where the crimson cloaks of Sparta cast shadows longer than memory itself. This is not a story of heroes rising triumphant against impossible odds, though triumph there was. This is not a tale of noble sacrifice for the greater good, though sacrifice permeated every breath these warriors drew. No, this is something far more unsettling, far more profound, and infinitely more disturbing than Hollywood would have you believe. This is the story of how a civilization took children, 7-year-old boys with gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees, and systematically, methodically, and with chilling efficiency, transformed them into the most feared killing machines the ancient world had ever seen. Welcome to the Agoj. Welcome to hell with a lesson plan. Before we march further into the mud and blood of Spartan discipline, drop a comment telling us which country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Let's see which brave souls are joining the Agoj at midnight in Manchester, dawn in Delhi, or sunset in São Paulo. Because tonight, regardless of your time zone, we're all walking barefoot through the thorns of history's most brutal education system. The year is 480 BCE. The narrow pass of Thermopylae echoes with the clash of bronze against bronze, the wet thud of spear points finding flesh, and the defiant war cries of 300 Spartan warriors who chose to die rather than yield. But this moment, this legendary last stand that would echo through eternity, didn't begin on that blood-soaked battlefield. It began decades earlier in the cramped barracks rooms where 7-year-old boys wept for mothers they would never see again. It began with the first lash of the whip across a child's back, the first night spent shivering on hard ground with an empty stomach, the first lesson that pain was not something to avoid, but something to embrace as an old friend. The Spartans didn't just train warriors, they manufactured them. And the process was as precise, as calculated, and as merciless as any assembly line that would ever exist. But instead of producing automobiles or textiles, they produced human beings who could march for days without food, sleep, standing up, in full armor, and drive a spear through an enemy's throat without hesitation or remorse. They created men who feared shame more than death, who viewed retreat as a fate worse than annihilation, and who would literally die before they would dishonor their city-state. How do you create such men? How do you take the natural compassion, curiosity, and playfulness of childhood and forge it into something harder than bronze, sharper than iron, and more implacable than stone? The answer lies in understanding that the Spartans didn't simply train their children to be warriors. They engineered them to be weapons. And weapons, by definition, must be stripped of everything that might interfere with their primary function, to kill efficiently and without question. The transformation began at birth. But the true horror, or brilliance, depending on your perspective, started at age 7. This was when Spartan boys were torn from their families and thrust into the Agoj, a state-controlled education system that would govern every aspect of their lives for the next 13 years. Imagine, if you will, the scene: a small boy, barely old enough to tie his own sandals, suddenly finding himself in a world where comfort was forbidden, where weakness was punished with brutal efficiency, and where the adults charged with his care viewed kindness as a form of corruption. The word agoj itself comes from the Greek verb meaning to lead or to guide. But this was guidance of the most ruthless kind. It was guidance toward a single, uncompromising destination, the creation of a perfect soldier. And the Spartans understood with a clarity that modern educational theorists still struggle to match that such creation required destruction first. They had to destroy the child to build the warrior. The boys were divided into groups called herds, bua in Greek, and assigned to communal barracks where they would live, eat, sleep, and suffer together. Privacy was not merely discouraged, it was impossible. Every moment of their lives was subject to observation, evaluation, and potential punishment. They slept on hard ground, their only bedding reeds they had gathered themselves from the banks of the river Europe. But even these reeds were a luxury that had to be earned through proper behavior and absolute obedience. Food, that most basic human need, became the first and most enduring lesson in the Spartan philosophy of education through deprivation. The boys were deliberately underfed, given just enough sustenance to maintain their strength for training, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though cruelty was certainly present. This was a calculated strategy designed to teach multiple lessons simultaneously. That comfort was weakness, that survival required constant vigilance and effort, and that the necessities of life were privileges to be earned rather than rights. To be expected, but here's where Spartan education revealed its truly diabolical genius. The boys were not only allowed but actively encouraged to steal food to supplement their meager rations. Theft, normally considered a moral failing in any civilized society, became part of the curriculum. The boys learned to move silently through shadows, to observe human behavior and exploit its patterns, to take what they needed without being detected. These were skills that would serve them well in warfare, where intelligence gathering and the ability to live off enemy territory often meant the difference between victory and defeat. However, and this is crucial to understanding the Spartan mindset, while theft was encouraged, getting caught was severely punished. The lesson was clear. Competence was valued, but incompetence would be met with pain. The boys who were caught stealing were flogged, not for stealing itself, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. This distinction taught them that success was not measured by moral standards, but by effectiveness. It was a lesson that would shape their approach to warfare for the rest of their lives. The beatings themselves deserve particular attention, not because they were unusual in the ancient world. Corporal punishment was common throughout Greece, but because of the systematic way in which the Spartans employed them as educational tools. Flogging was not an emotional outburst from frustrated instructors. It was a precise instrument of psychological conditioning. The boys were beaten for showing weakness, for expressing homesickness, for crying, for asking questions, for not asking questions, for hesitating in combat training, for being too aggressive in combat training, in short, for being human children, rather than efficient killing machines. But perhaps most importantly, they were beaten for showing compassion toward their fellow students. The Spartans understood that soldiers who form emotional attachments to their comrades might hesitate at crucial moments, might compromise a mission to save a friend, might choose personal loyalty over duty to the state. Such sentiments had to be cauterized from their souls while they were still young enough for the wounds to heal completely. The boys learned to endure these beatings in complete silence. Crying out was considered a grave offense that would result in even more severe punishment. They learned to school their facial expressions, to control their breathing, to give no indication of the pain that was being inflicted upon them. This training in emotional suppression would prove invaluable in warfare, where showing pain or fear could encourage enemies and demoralize allies. Physical conditioning in the agoge went far beyond simple military drills. The boys were required to exercise naked in all weather conditions, building tolerance for heat, cold, rain, and wind. They ran barefoot over rocky terrain until their feet became as tough as leather sandals. They practiced gymnastics, wrestling, and pankration, a brutal form of martial arts that combined wrestling and boxing with virtually no rules, except that eye gouging and biting were forbidden. The concept of fair play, so important to other Greek city-states, was largely absent from Spartan training. Boys were taught to use any advantage available to them, to exploit their opponent's weaknesses without mercy, and to view honor not as adherence to some abstract code of conduct but as victory, achieved through superior skill and ruthless application of force. They learned to fight dirty because, as their instructors constantly reminded them, their enemies certainly would. Dancing played a surprisingly important role in Spartan education. But these were not the artistic dances of Athens or the religious ceremonies of other Greek cities. Spartan dances were martial exercises disguised as cultural activities. The boys learned complex formations that mirrored battle tactics, practiced synchronized movements that would later help them maintain formation under enemy fire, and developed the rhythmic precision that would allow hundreds of warriors to move as a single, coordinated unit on the battlefield. Music too was part of their education, but again with a distinctly military flavor. They learned to play the awos, a double-piped wind instrument, not for artistic expression, but because armies marched to music and commanders issued orders through musical signals. The ability to maintain rhythm while under stress, to coordinate complex movements through sound alone, and to communicate across the chaos of battle through predetermined musical codes were all skills that would prove invaluable in warfare. The Spartans were perhaps unique among ancient peoples in their systematic approach to psychological conditioning. They understood, centuries before modern psychology would formalize these concepts, that the mind could be trained just as rigorously as the body. The boys were subjected to constant stress, not randomly but in carefully calibrated doses designed to build resistance to fear, pain, and despair. They were forced to make speeches while being physically punished, learning to maintain clarity of thought under extreme duress. They were required to perform complex tasks while exhausted, hungry, and in pain, developing the ability to function effectively even when every instinct screamed for rest and relief. They were placed in situations where failure meant punishment, not just for themselves but for their entire group, teaching them that individual weakness had collective consequences. Sleep deprivation was another tool in the Spartan arsenal of psychological conditioning. The boys were often kept awake for days at a time, required to maintain alertness and perform their duties despite overwhelming fatigue. This training proved invaluable in warfare, where battles could last for days and the ability to function without sleep often determined victory or defeat. The relationship between older and younger boys in the Agoge was complex and, by modern standards, deeply troubling. Each group of younger boys was assigned to an older boy who served as their leader, mentor, and disciplinarian. This Erastes-Menos relationship, common throughout ancient Greece but particularly systematized in Sparta, involved not just military instruction but intimate emotional and often physical relationships. The older boys were given complete authority over their younger charges, including the right to punish them for any perceived failure or weakness. This created a hierarchical system where every boy except the very youngest had someone beneath him to dominate and someone above him to fear. It was a brilliant method of social control that ensured that rebellion against the system was virtually impossible, since even the victims of the system held positions of power over those below them. These relationships were not merely tolerated by Spartan society, they were actively encouraged as part of the educational process. The older boys were expected to take personal responsibility for the development of their younger partners, and their own advancement within the system depended partly on how well their protégés performed. This created an incentive for the older boys to be demanding instructors while also investing emotionally in their students' success. However, the Spartans were careful to ensure that these relationships did not undermine military effectiveness. Public displays of affection were forbidden, and any sign that emotional attachment was interfering with military duty was severely punished. The boys learned that while intimate relationships were part of their world, they could never be allowed to supersede their obligations to the state. The educational curriculum extended beyond purely military subjects. Though everything was filtered through the lens of warfare, the boys learned to read and write, but only enough to understand military orders and communicate essential information. They studied music and poetry, but focused on martial themes and works that glorified courage, sacrifice, and devotion to Sparta. They learned rhetoric, but their training emphasized brevity and clarity rather than the elaborate oratory prized in Athens. This educational philosophy gave rise to the term laconic, derived from Laconia, the region around Sparta. Spartan speech was famously brief and to the point, stripped of unnecessary embellishment or emotional expression. When Philip of Macedon sent a message to Sparta, threatening to destroy the city if he entered Laconia, the Spartans replied with a single word, if. This wasn't just linguistic efficiency. It was part of their broader philosophy that valued substance over style, action over words, and results over process. The boys were taught history, but again with a distinctly Spartan perspective. They learned about the great victories of their ancestors, the legendary heroes who had died rather than retreat, and the divine favor that their city enjoyed as a result of its unwavering commitment to military excellence. They memorized genealogies that traced their lineage back to Hercules and other mythical heroes, reinforcing their sense of themselves as a people apart, chosen by the gods for greatness. Geography was studied primarily from a military perspective. The boys learned to read terrain like a book, to identify defensive positions and potential ambush sites, to calculate distances and travel times for military formations. They studied the coastlines and mountain passes of Greece not as tourists, appreciating natural beauty, but as strategists seeking advantages and identifying vulnerabilities. Mathematics was similarly practical in focus. The boys learned to calculate supplies needed for military campaigns, to determine the optimal spacing for battle formations, and to estimate enemy numbers based on observed formations. They studied geometry as it applied to siege, warfare, and the construction of military fortifications. The concept of individual identity was systematically dismantled throughout the Agoge experience. Boys were referred to not by their personal names, but by group designations and ranking within their units. Their individual preferences, fears, and desires were treated as obstacles to be overcome, rather than aspects of personality to be developed. They learned to think of themselves not as unique individuals with personal goals and dreams, but as interchangeable components in the great machine of Spartan military power. This process of depersonalization was reinforced through every aspect of their daily routine. They wore identical simple clothes, ate identical food, slept in identical conditions, and followed identical schedules. Any attempt to assert individuality through personal possessions, special friendships, or unique behaviors was swiftly punished. They learned that standing out from the group, even in positive ways, was dangerous and counterproductive. The boys were taught to view pain not as something to be avoided, but as a valuable teacher. They learned to distinguish between different types of pain: the sharp warning of injury that required attention, the dull ache of exhaustion that could be ignored, the burning sensation of muscles being pushed beyond their limits that indicated progress. They developed an almost supernatural tolerance for physical discomfort, viewing it as simply another aspect of existence to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. This relationship with pain extended beyond the purely physical. They were taught to endure emotional pain with the same stoicism they applied to physical suffering. Homesickness, loneliness, fear, and despair were all treated as weaknesses to be overcome through discipline and willpower. They learned to suppress these emotions so thoroughly that many Spartan warriors seemed almost inhuman to their enemies and allies alike. The training in violence was gradual but relentless. The boys began with wrestling and boxing matches against each other, learning to inflict and receive pain in controlled circumstances. They progressed to weapons training with wooden swords and spears, practicing strikes and parries until the movements became instinctive. Eventually, they moved to real weapons, first in careful drills and then in increasingly realistic combat scenarios. The Spartans understood that killing another human being, despite being central to warfare, went against fundamental human instincts. Most people, even soldiers, experience significant psychological resistance to taking a life. The Agoj was designed to overcome this resistance through systematic desensitization and conditioning. The boys were taught to view enemies not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved, or threats to be eliminated. This dehumanization of potential enemies began early and was reinforced constantly. The boys were told stories of foreign peoples who were portrayed as subhuman monsters threatening the Spartan way of life. They were taught that showing mercy to enemies was not compassion, but weakness that endangered their comrades and their city. They learned to take pride in their ability to kill efficiently and without emotional disturbance. The culmination of this training in violence came during their participation in the Cryptia. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire Spartan education system. When the boys reached their final years in the Agoj, the most promising among them were selected for this secret police force that was tasked with maintaining control over Sparta's massive population of Helotsta, enslaved people who performed the agricultural labor that supported Spartan society. The Cryptia operations were conducted in complete secrecy and with absolute brutality. The young Spartans would be sent out into the countryside with minimal equipment and instructions to survive by any means necessary, while eliminating helots who showed signs of potential rebellion. This wasn't warfare in any conventional sense. It was state-sponsored terrorism designed to keep an enslaved population in perpetual fear. The psychological impact of participation in the Cryptia cannot be overstated. These young men, still teenagers by modern standards, were required to hunt down and murder unarmed people whose only crime was showing intelligence, leadership potential, or signs of resistance to their enslavement. They had to do this alone, in secret, and then return to normal life as if nothing had happened. This experience served multiple purposes in the Spartan system. It provided practical training in survival skills, stealth, and killing under realistic conditions. It demonstrated absolute loyalty to the state by requiring participants to commit acts that most human beings would find morally repugnant, and it created a psychological bond between the participants and the system that had required these acts of them. since acknowledging the moral wrongness of what they had done would require them to confront the fundamental illegitimacy of their entire society. The boys who survived this process and survival was not guaranteed emerged as something entirely different from what they had been when they entered the system at age 7. They were no longer children, nor were they quite normal adults. They were weapons in human form, carefully crafted instruments of violence who had been stripped of most normal human emotions and responses. They had learned to endure pain without complaint, to inflict pain without remorse, to follow orders without question, and to value the approval of their military superiors above their own lives. They had been taught that individual happiness was not only unimportant but actively dangerous, that personal relationships were acceptable only insofar as they served military purposes, and that the state's needs always superseded any individual concerns. The physical transformation was equally dramatic. 20 years of rigorous training, minimal food, and constant physical stress produced bodies that were lean, hard, and incredibly resilient. These men could march 50 miles in a day, fight in heavy armor for hours without rest, and continue functioning effectively despite wounds that would incapacitate normal soldiers. But perhaps more importantly, they had developed an almost supernatural coordination and teamwork ability. The countless hours of synchronized drilling, the shared hardships, and the systematic suppression of individual ego created military units that functioned with mechanical precision. In battle, Spartan formations moved like single organisms, each warrior instinctively responding to the actions of his comrades without need for verbal communication. This coordination extended beyond mere tactical movements. The Spartans developed what modern military theorists would recognize as exceptional unit cohesion, the psychological bonds that keep soldiers fighting even when facing overwhelming odds. But Spartan unit cohesion was different from what develops naturally among soldiers who serve together. It was artificially created through shared trauma, systematic conditioning, and the complete subordination of individual identity to group identity. The graduation from the agoge at age 20 did not mark the end of military training, but rather the beginning of adult military service. The young men who completed the program were assigned to military units where they would continue to live communally, eating in common messes and sleeping in military barracks. Marriage was permitted, but married men were still required to spend most of their time with their military units rather than with their families. This lifelong military service created a society unlike anything else in the ancient world. Sparta was not a normal city-state that happened to have an effective military. It was a military organization that happened to control territory. Every aspect of Spartan society was subordinated to military needs, from the economic system that relied on helot labor to free citizens for military service, to the political system that concentrated power in the hands of military leaders. The effectiveness of this system was demonstrated repeatedly on ancient battlefields. Spartan armies were virtually unbeatable in conventional warfare, not because they had superior equipment or greater numbers, but because they had superior soldiers. The individual Spartan warrior was stronger, more skilled, more disciplined, and more psychologically prepared for combat than any potential opponent. But this effectiveness came at a terrible cost. The Spartan birth rate was chronically low, partly because the agoge system was so brutal that many boys did not survive it, and partly because the lifestyle required for maintaining military readiness was not conducive to family life. The population of full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, declined steadily throughout the classical period, from perhaps 8,000 at the time of the Persian Wars to fewer than 1,000 by the time of the Roman conquest. The psychological cost was equally devastating. The Spartans created a society of highly functional psychopaths, individuals who were capable of extreme violence without emotional disturbance, but who were also incapable of normal human relationships and emotions. They had solved the military problem of creating effective warriors, but in doing so, they had sacrificed most of what makes life worth living. The Spartan system also created individuals who were extremely vulnerable to situations that fell outside their training parameters. The Agoge produced men who were supremely effective at conventional warfare, but who struggled with the political flexibility and adaptability that were increasingly important in the changing world of classical Greece. They were specialists in violence, who were often helpless when confronted with problems that could not be solved through application of force. The decline of Sparta was directly related to the limitations of their educational system, as warfare became more complex, requiring greater use of siege equipment, naval forces, and mercenary troops. The Spartan advantage diminished. Their enemies learned to avoid conventional battles where Spartan superiority was decisive, instead employing strategies that exploited Spartan inflexibility and limited numbers. Moreover, the Spartan system was completely dependent on the continued subjugation of the Helot population. When Helot revolts became more frequent and more successful, Sparta was forced to devote increasing resources to internal security rather than external conquest. The very brutality that had made the Cryptia an effective tool of oppression eventually created such hatred among the Helot population that rebellion became inevitable. The final irony of the Spartan system was that it created warriors who were psychologically incapable of adapting to changing circumstances. They had been taught from childhood that the Spartan way was not merely effective, but divinely ordained, that any deviation from traditional methods was tantamount to moral corruption. When faced with military and political challenges that required new approaches, they were unable to respond effectively because their entire worldview was built on the assumption that their methods were perfect and unchangeable. Yet for nearly 3 centuries, the Spartan system worked with terrifying effectiveness. It created military units that were feared throughout the Mediterranean world. Warriors whose reputation for invincibility was so complete that some enemies would retreat without fighting rather than face them in battle. The psychological warfare value of Spartan military reputation was often as important as their actual combat effectiveness. The Battle of Thermopylae, while ultimately a defeat, demonstrated the incredible effectiveness of Spartan training. 300 warriors, supported by perhaps 700 other Greeks, held off an army that ancient sources claim numbered in the millions for 3 days. While modern historians dispute the numbers involved, there is no question that a tiny force of Greeks inflicted enormous casualties on a vastly superior enemy army through superior training, discipline, and tactical skill. The Spartans at Thermopylae fought not just as individual warriors, but as a perfectly coordinated unit. Their shield wall held firm despite repeated assaults by the cream of the Persian army. They advanced and retreated in perfect formation, maintained discipline under the most extreme pressure, and continued fighting effectively even when facing inevitable death. This was the Agoge in action. 20 years of brutal training, producing warriors who functioned more like machines than men. But Thermopylae also demonstrated the limitations of the Spartan system. The 300 died because they could not adapt to changed circumstances when the Persians found a path around their position. A more flexible force might have withdrawn to fight another day, but the Spartans had been trained to view retreat as unthinkable. Their psychological conditioning, which made them so effective in conventional battles, also made them incapable of strategic flexibility when the situation required it. The legacy of Spartan military training extends far beyond ancient Greece. Every military organization that has sought to create elite units has studied Spartan methods and adapted them to modern circumstances. The concept of breaking down recruits through systematic stress and then rebuilding them as warriors is central to military training programs throughout the world. Modern special forces training incorporates many elements that would be familiar to ancient Spartans: sleep deprivation, physical hardship, psychological pressure, and the systematic elimination of individual comfort and privacy. The goal remains the same: to create soldiers who will continue to function effectively under extreme stress and who will place mission accomplishment above personal survival. However, modern military training also recognizes the limitations and dangers of the Spartan approach. Contemporary military psychology understands that while systematic trauma can create effective warriors in the short term, it also produces long-term psychological damage that can undermine military effectiveness and destroy individuals' ability to function in civilian society. The Spartan approach to military training was brutally effective because it solved the fundamental problem of warfare: how to get human beings to kill other human beings efficiently and without hesitation. But it solved this problem by essentially destroying the humanity of the warriors it created. The men who emerged from the Agoge were superb at their intended function, but they were also psychological cripples who were incapable of normal human relationships and emotions. In the end, the Spartan system represents both the ultimate achievement and the ultimate failure of military training. It created the most effective warriors the ancient world had ever seen, but at the cost of everything that makes life worth living. It demonstrated that human beings can be conditioned to overcome almost any natural instinct or emotion, but also showed the terrible price that such conditioning exacts. The boys who entered the Agoge at age 7 with gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees emerged 20 years later as something else entirely, not quite human, not quite machine, but perfectly adapted to the single purpose for which they had been created. They were living weapons forged in the brutal furnaces of systematic trauma and conditioning, and for nearly 3 centuries they dominated the battlefields of the ancient world. But weapons, no matter how perfectly crafted, eventually become obsolete. The world changed around Sparta, requiring different skills and different approaches to warfare and politics. The men the Agoge produced were too specialized, too rigid, and too psychologically damaged to adapt to these changes. The very perfection of their conditioning became their ultimate weakness. The Spartan Agoge stands as history's most successful attempt to systematically manufacture warriors. It achieved its goal with terrifying efficiency, creating soldiers who were feared throughout the known world. But it also serves as a warning about the costs of such systematic dehumanization. The boys who survived the Agoge became legends, but they also ceased to be fully human. In solving the problem of how to create perfect warriors, the Spartans discovered that perfection in warfare requires the sacrifice of everything else that makes life meaningful. Tonight, as you consider this ancient experiment in human conditioning, remember that those gap-toothed 7-year-olds who entered the Agoge were not volunteers. They were children torn from their families and subjected to 20 years of systematic brutalization in service of a society that valued military effectiveness above human dignity. Their sacrifice created one of history's most effective military forces, but it also stands as a testament to both the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the terrible depths to which human societies can sink in pursuit of power. The crimson cloaks of Sparta may have faded into history, but the questions raised by their methods remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. How far should a society go to protect itself? What is the acceptable cost of military effectiveness? And at what point do the means employed to achieve security become more destructive than the threats they are meant to address? These are questions that every society must answer for itself, but the example of Sparta serves as both inspiration and warning. For those who would seek to create the perfect warrior, the Agoge succeeded in its purpose, but that purpose was ultimately self-defeating. In creating men who were more weapons than human beings, Sparta gained temporary military supremacy but lost the flexibility, creativity, and humanity necessary for long-term survival. The boys who went into that system as children emerged as something else entirely, creatures of discipline and violence, who were perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed by the time they were ready to inherit it. But to truly understand the brutal effectiveness of Spartan training, we must delve deeper into the specific techniques that forged these human weapons. The daily routine of an Agoge student would have broken the spirit of most modern adults within weeks. Yet 7-year-old children were expected not merely to endure it, but to thrive within its crushing parameters. The morning began before dawn with what the Spartans called the awakening of iron. Boys were roused not by gentle calls or even harsh shouts, but by the systematic application of cold water, and if that proved insufficient, the liberal use of leather straps across bare backs. There were no snooze buttons in ancient Sparta, no gradual transition from sleep to wakefulness. The boys learned that consciousness was not a natural process, but a military necessity that could be imposed through external force when internal discipline proved inadequate. Physical training began immediately. Before the boys had fully awakened, before they had eaten, and certainly before they had time to contemplate the misery of their situation. This was deliberate. The Spartans understood that the human mind, given time to consider its circumstances, might rebel against conditions that the body could be trained to endure. By keeping the boys in a constant state of physical activity and mental exhaustion, the instructors prevented the kind of reflective thinking that might lead to resistance, or, worse yet, the development of individual identity. The exercises themselves were designed not just to build physical strength, but to create specific types of psychological conditioning. Running was never simply running. It was pursuit of enemies or escape from superior forces. Wrestling was never mere athletic competition. It was close quarters, combat training, where the objective was not to defeat an opponent according to rules, but to incapacitate a threat by any means necessary. Swimming was practiced not in comfortable pools, but in the frigid waters of mountain streams, often while wearing armor, because a warrior who could not cross water obstacles was a warrior with limited tactical utility. One particularly revealing aspect of Spartan physical training was their approach to pain management. Modern athletic training recognizes the difference between productive discomfort and potentially harmful injury, encouraging athletes to push through the former while respecting the latter. The Spartans made no such distinction. Boys were expected to continue exercising through injuries that would sideline modern athletes for weeks or months. Broken bones were splinted, and the training continued. Torn muscles were wrapped, and the exercises resumed. Open wounds were bandaged, and the drills proceeded. This wasn't simply ignorance of medical science, though medical knowledge in ancient Greece was certainly limited compared to modern standards. It was a deliberate strategy to teach the boys That physical damage was not an excuse for failing to perform their duties. A Spartan warrior might find himself wounded in battle, but still required to fight for hours or even days before the engagement ended. The ability to function effectively, despite serious injury, was not just useful. It was essential for survival. The psychological impact of this approach to injury cannot be understated. The boys learned not only to tolerate pain, but to dissociate from it entirely. They developed what modern psychology would recognize as a form of dissociation disorder, where consciousness separates from physical sensation as a protective mechanism. But in the Spartan context, this dissociation was not pathology, but adaptation. Not illness, but skill. Food rationing, as mentioned earlier, was central to a Gouge conditioning. But the specific mechanisms deserve closer examination. The boys were not simply given less food than they wanted. They were given less food than they needed for optimal physical development. Modern nutritionists would be horrified by the caloric restrictions imposed on growing children engaged in intense physical activity for 12 to 14 hours per day. But the Spartans were not trying to optimize physical development in the conventional sense. They were trying to create bodies that could function effectively under starvation conditions, minds that could remain sharp despite constant hunger, and psyches that viewed scarcity as the natural state of existence. A well-fed warrior was a warrior who had grown dependent on regular meals and abundant supplies. A warrior who had learned to function effectively while slowly starving was a warrior who could campaign in enemy territory for months without supply lines. The boys learned to supplement their rations not just through theft, but through foraging, hunting, and what modern military forces would call living off the land. They became expert at identifying edible plants, catching small animals, and finding water sources. These skills were taught not through classroom instruction, but through necessity. Boys who could not successfully supplement their rations simply starved. The theft component of this training was particularly sophisticated. The boys were not encouraged to steal randomly or impulsively. They were taught to observe target households, to identify patterns of behavior, to wait for optimal opportunities, and to plan their operations with military precision. They learned to case targets like modern burglars, to move silently like modern special forces operators, and to improvise solutions to unexpected problems like modern intelligence agents when caught. The punishment was severe, not because theft was morally wrong, but because poor operational security endangered the mission. The boys learned that competence was the highest virtue, and incompetence the gravest sin. This lesson would serve them well in warfare, where tactical mistakes could result not just in personal death, but in the destruction of entire military units. The social dynamics within a Gouge groups were carefully managed to prevent the formation of personal loyalties that might conflict with loyalty to the state. While the boys lived together, trained together, and suffered together, they were also constantly competing against each other for the limited rewards available within the system. Food, better sleeping positions, and reduced punishment were all distributed based on performance rankings that were constantly shifting. This created an environment where cooperation was necessary for group survival, but individual competition was required for personal advancement. The boys learned to work together when the situation demanded it, while remaining ready to exploit their comrades' weaknesses when opportunity arose. They developed what modern behavioral psychologists would recognize as a highly sophisticated understanding of game theory, though they learned it not through abstract study, but through daily application in life and death situations. The older boys who served as leaders and mentors were given authority. not just over training but over every aspect of the younger boys' lives. They determined sleeping arrangements, assigned work details, and administered punishment for infractions both real and perceived. This created a system where authority was not abstract but personal, where power was not theoretical but immediate and physical. But the older boys were also held responsible for the performance of their younger charges. If a younger boy failed in training or committed an infraction, the older boy who was supposed to be supervising him was also punished. This created a powerful incentive for the older boys to be demanding supervisors, while also ensuring that they had a personal stake in the success of their protégés. The relationships that developed within this system were unlike anything found in normal human society. They combined elements of mentorship, sexual relationship, military command structure, and master-slave dynamics into something that was simultaneously intimate and brutal, caring and exploitative. These relationships taught the boys that love and violence were not opposites but complementary aspects of the same. Fundamental reality. Combat training progressed through carefully designed stages that gradually increased in lethality and psychological intensity. The boys began with bare-handed fighting, learning to use their fists, elbows, knees, and feet as weapons. They progressed to training with sticks and clubs, then to wooden weapons that mimicked real swords and spears, and finally, to actual bronze and iron weapons that could maim or kill. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to fight in formation. Individual combat skills, while useful, were secondary to the ability to function as part of a coordinated military unit. The boys spent countless hours practicing the intricate steps and movements that would allow hundreds of warriors to move as a single organism on the battlefield. They learned to maintain formation while advancing, retreating, turning, and engaging in combat. The famous Spartan phalanx formation was not simply a military tactic. It was a physical manifestation of the psychological conditioning that began in the age. Each warrior carried a large shield that protected not just himself but the man to his left. This meant that a warrior's survival depended not just on his own skill and courage but on the reliability of his comrades. A warrior who broke formation or fled from battle endangered not just himself but everyone around him. This mutual dependence was reinforced through training exercises where individual failure resulted in group punishment. If one boy broke formation during drill, the entire group was beaten. If one boy showed fear during a training exercise, everyone suffered reduced rations. The boys learned viscerally that individual weakness or selfishness was not just personally disadvantageous, but collectively dangerous. The psychological preparation for killing deserves particular attention because it represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire system. Most human beings, even soldiers, experience significant psychological resistance to taking another person's life. Modern military training has developed sophisticated techniques for overcoming this resistance. But the Spartans were pioneers in this field. The process began with the killing of animals. The boys were required to hunt and slaughter their own food, learning to associate the taking of life with survival necessity. They progressed to larger animals, eventually participating in the ritual sacrifice of livestock during religious ceremonies. These experiences taught them that killing was not aberrant behavior, but normal and necessary activity. But animal killing, while useful for desensitization, was insufficient preparation for killing humans. The Spartans solved this problem through the cryptia operations mentioned earlier. But the psychological preparation for these operations began years before the boys were old enough to participate. They were told stories that systematically dehumanized Potential enemies, particularly the Helot population. Helots were described not as fellow human beings who happened to be enslaved, but as dangerous animals that threatened Spartan civilization. They were portrayed as inherently violent, inherently treacherous, and inherently inferior beings whose continued existence was a constant threat to everything good and noble in the world. The boys were taught that showing mercy to Helots was not compassion, but dangerous naivety that could result in the destruction of their families and their city. They learned to view violence against Helots not as cruelty, but as necessary preventive action, like killing dangerous wild animals or destroying diseased crops before they could spread contamination. This dehumanization was reinforced through direct contact with Helots under carefully controlled circumstances. The boys would observe Helots working in the fields, always under guard and always in conditions that emphasized their subjugation and supposed inferiority. They would witness punishments being administered to Helots who violated regulations or showed signs of resistance. These observations were carefully choreographed to reinforce the lessons being taught. The boys never saw Helots in circumstances that might evoke empathy or recognition of common humanity. They never saw Helot families caring for their children, Helot craftsmen creating beautiful objects, or Helot individuals displaying intelligence, creativity, or moral virtue. They saw only subjugation, punishment, and evidence of supposed inferiority. When the time came for participation in cryptia operations, the psychological groundwork had been laid so thoroughly that most boys were able to kill without the emotional trauma that such actions would normally produce. They had been taught to view their victims not as human beings, but as threats to be eliminated, problems to be solved, or obstacles to be removed. The selection process for cryptia participation was itself a form of psychological conditioning. Only the most promising boys were chosen, and selection was presented as a great honor rather than a horrible necessity. The boys competed for the privilege of being allowed to hunt and kill Helots, viewing it as recognition of their superior development rather than as an assignment to commit murder. This reframing of atrocity as honor was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire Spartan system. The boys learned not just to commit acts that normal human beings would find morally repugnant, but to take pride in their ability to do so. They learned to view their capacity for violence without remorse, not as psychological damage, but as evidence of superior character and development. The long-term psychological effects of this conditioning were profound and permanent. The men who emerged from the agoge were not simply skilled warriors. They were individuals who had been fundamentally altered at the deepest levels of personality and moral development. They had learned to find meaning and identity through violence, to view compassion as weakness, and to subordinate all human emotions to the demands of military effectiveness. But these psychological alterations, while making them supremely effective warriors, also made them poorly adapted for peacetime existence. Spartan society had to be organized around constant military activity because the men it produced were psychologically incapable of finding satisfaction or meaning in civilian pursuits. They needed enemies to fight, territories to conquer, and opponents to defeat, because these were the only activities that could provide the sense of purpose and identity that had been programmed into them during their youth. This created a society that was perpetually at war, not by choice, but by necessity. The Spartans could not simply choose to live peacefully because they had created a population that was psychologically dependent on conflict for basic psychological stability. They had solved the problem of military effectiveness so thoroughly that they had made normal human life impossible for their citizens. the physical conditioning achieved through the agoge was equally extreme and permanent. The men who completed the program possessed strength, endurance, and pain tolerance that were virtually superhuman by normal standards. They could march for days without rest, fight in heavy armor for hours without fatigue, and continue functioning, despite injuries that would incapacitate normal individuals. But this physical conditioning came at a significant cost in terms of long-term health and life expectancy. The chronic malnutrition during crucial developmental years produced men who were lean and strong, but also shorter and less robust than they might have been under normal conditions. The constant physical trauma and exposure to harsh conditions created bodies that were incredibly resilient in the short term, but prone to early breakdown and premature aging. The social structure that emerged from this training system was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Adult Spartan men continued to live largely communal lives, eating together in military messes and spending most of their time with their military units rather than with their families. Marriage was permitted and even encouraged for reproductive purposes, but it was subordinated to military obligations in every respect. Spartan women, while not subjected to the agoge themselves, were also conditioned from childhood to serve the military needs of the state. They were given physical training that was unusual for women in ancient Greece, not for their own benefit, but to produce stronger children for future military service. They were taught to value military achievement above all other considerations, and to view their primary role as the production and support of warriors. The famous Spartan mother who told her son to return from battle with his shield or on it was not expressing unusual maternal sentiment, but reflecting the systematic indoctrination that all Spartan women received. They learned to measure their success as mothers not by their children's happiness or personal achievement, but by their military effectiveness and willingness to die for the state. This created a society where normal human relationships were subordinated to military objectives at every level. Spartan marriages were brief, functional arrangements focused on reproduction rather than companionship or emotional satisfaction. Spartan parent-child relationships were evaluated primarily in terms of their contribution to military readiness. Spartan friendships were valuable mainly insofar as they enhanced combat effectiveness. The economic system that supported this military society was equally distorted by the demands of creating and maintaining professional warriors. The Spartans themselves were forbidden to engage in trade, craftsmanship, or agriculture activities that were considered incompatible with full-time military service. All productive labor was performed by helots and pariochi, free but non-citizen residents, creating a society where the ruling class was entirely dependent on the labor of others. This economic arrangement was inherently unstable because it required the continued subjugation of a helot population that vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens. The Spartans were constantly aware that they were surrounded by people who had every reason to hate them and who would rebel if given the opportunity. This awareness reinforced their commitment to military preparedness, but also created a siege mentality that influenced every aspect of their society. The religious and cultural life of Sparta was similarly subordinated to military objectives. Spartan religious festivals were primarily military exercises disguised as religious observances. Spartan art and literature celebrated military themes almost exclusively. Spartan music and dance were designed to reinforce military discipline and coordination rather than to provide aesthetic pleasure or spiritual enrichment. Even Spartan concepts of honor and virtue were defined entirely in military terms. A good Spartan was one who fought bravely, obeyed orders without question, and died heroically if necessary. Qualities that other Greek city-states valued: intellectual curiosity, artistic creativity, commercial acumen, or diplomatic skill were viewed with suspicion in Sparta, because they might distract from the single-minded focus on military excellence. This narrow definition of human value created a society that was incredibly effective at its chosen specialty, but utterly inflexible when faced with challenges that could not be solved through application of military force. The Spartans were superb at conventional warfare, but hopeless at diplomacy, trade negotiations, cultural exchange, or any other activity that required understanding and accommodation of different perspectives. The decline of Spartan power was directly related to these limitations. As the Greek world became more complex and interconnected, military prowess alone was no longer sufficient for maintaining political dominance. The Spartans found themselves increasingly outmaneuvered by opponents who could combine military capability with diplomatic skill, economic power, and cultural influence. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE marked the beginning of the end for Spartan military supremacy. For the first time in their history, a Spartan army was decisively defeated in conventional battle by another Greek force. The psychological impact of this defeat was devastating because it challenged the fundamental assumptions on which Spartan society was based. If Spartan military training was not guaranteed to produce victory, then what was the justification for the enormous sacrifices it required? If Spartan warriors could be defeated by men who had not endured the gorge, then perhaps the gorge was not the pinnacle of military education that the Spartans believed it to be. These questions, once raised, could not be easily answered within the framework of Spartan ideology. The military innovations that defeated the Spartans at Leuctra: deeper phalanx formations, more flexible tactical arrangements, and better coordination between different types of military units were all developments that required the kind of intellectual creativity and adaptability that the Agoge systematically suppressed. The Thebans who won the battle had learned to think about warfare in new ways, while the Spartans remained locked into tactical and strategic approaches that had been successful centuries earlier. This pattern repeated itself throughout the remaining history of independent Sparta. Every military innovation that required intellectual flexibility or adaptation to new circumstances found the Spartans unprepared and unable to respond effectively. They continued to train warriors using methods that had been perfected for an earlier era of warfare, producing men who were superbly equipped for battles that were no longer being fought. The final conquest of Sparta by Rome in 146 BCE was almost anticlimactic. By that time, the Spartan population had declined to fewer than 1,000 adult males, and the Agoge system was being maintained more for tourist appeal than for military necessity. The Romans were curious about Spartan training methods, but recognized them as historical curiosities rather than serious military threats. Yet the legacy of the Agoge extends far beyond the specific historical context in which it was developed. Every military organization that has sought to create elite units has borrowed elements from Spartan training methods. The concept of systematic stress inoculation, the use of controlled deprivation to build resilience, and the application of group punishment to enforce individual discipline can all be traced back to innovations first implemented in ancient Sparta. Modern military training recognizes both the effectiveness and the dangers of these methods. Contemporary special forces training programs incorporate many Spartan techniques, but also include psychological support systems designed to prevent the kind of dehumanization that characterized the Agoge. Modern military psychology understands that while extreme training can create highly effective warriors, it can also produce individuals who are unable to function in civilian society after their military service ends. The Spartans had no such concerns, because they never intended their warriors to function in civilian society. The Agoge was designed to create lifetime soldiers who would never need to adapt to peacetime existence. This approach worked for several centuries, but it ultimately proved to be a dead end in human social development. The boys who entered the Agoge at age 7 were sacrificed to create something that was simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. Human beings who had transcended normal human limitations through the systematic destruction of their humanity. They became legends, but they ceased to be fully human. They achieved immortality in history, but at the cost of mortal happiness and normal human experience. As we reach the end of this journey through the blood-soaked valleys of ancient Laconia, we are left with profound questions about the nature of human potential and the costs of pursuing perfection. The Spartan Agoge represents the ultimate experiment in human conditioning, a systematic attempt to create perfect warriors through the complete subordination of individual humanity to collective military objectives. The experiment succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of its creators. For nearly 3 centuries, Spartan warriors dominated the battlefields of the ancient world, their very names striking fear into the hearts of enemies who knew that fighting them meant facing opponents who literally feared nothing except failure. In their duty, the Agoge created men who could endure any hardship, overcome any obstacle, and face any danger without hesitation or doubt. But success, in this case, was also failure. In creating perfect warriors, the Spartans destroyed everything else that makes life worth living. They sacrificed love for discipline, creativity for conformity, individual happiness for collective effectiveness, and human dignity for military supremacy. They proved that human beings can be conditioned to transcend normal limitations, but they also demonstrated the terrible price that such transcendence requires. The gap-toothed 7-year-olds who disappeared into the Agoge emerged 20 years later as something else entirely, not quite human, not quite machine, but perfectly adapted to the single purpose for which they had been created. They were living proof of both the incredible plasticity of human nature and the devastating consequences of pushing that plasticity to its absolute limits. Tonight, as you consider their story, remember that these were not volunteers who chose their fate, but children who were sacrificed to serve the ambitions of a society that valued military power above human dignity. Their achievement was remarkable, but it was bought with the coin of human suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. They became legends, but legends are easier to admire from a distance than to live within daily reality. The crimson cloaks of Sparta have faded into history, but the questions they raise about human nature, social organization, and the costs of pursuing perfection remain as relevant today as they were 25 centuries ago. In an age when we continue to search for ways to maximize human potential and create more effective organizations, the example of Sparta serves as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that every gain comes with a cost, and that sometimes the price of perfection is too high for any civilized society to pay.